Venezuela is the single most mismanaged economy in the world, and while that's a big claim with some stiff competition, there are simply no other countries on Earth that have fumbled such a privileged position quite so badly. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves of any country in the world by a significant margin. The runner-up, Saudi Arabia, would have to find an entire USA worth of extra oil just to meet the reserves of this single small South American nation. Now, we have seen many times on this channel before that natural resource wealth does not equal economic prosperity. But at this scale of natural resource wealth, the country could have effectively brute forced its way into the global upper class. Unfortunately, what should have been an easy path of prosperity was squandered, and from its peak the country has lost more than 80% of its GDP in less than a decade. The collapse was so bad that many international economic agencies just don't collect data on it anymore because the economy was too mismanaged. It would almost be laughable if it wasn't so tragic. The country is now one of the most dangerous and impoverished economies in the world. Venezuela, for a variety of reasons that are each worth exploring individually, has become very isolated from the rest of the world. Its people are leaving in droves, and governance has become so unstable that it can't even get access to the manpower and investments needed to extract its abundant oil reserves. This is a situation that is not getting any better. Late last year, the country threatened to annex neighbouring Guyana, further alienating it in the global community, and now, just late last month, the country held a highly controversial election raising huge question marks about who is really in charge. Venezuela is the national equivalent of a lottery winner that's too incompetent to even claim their winning ticket, let alone manage the money once they get it. But if there's more to learn from failure than success, it's a good place to start. So, how did a country with so much going for it end up so poor? Were these problems coming purely from within, or were there external forces pushing for its demise? And finally, of course, is there any realistic way for the country to turn its economy around? Once we have done all of that, we can put Venezuela, the most mismanaged economy in the world, on the Economics Explained leaderboard. Venezuela has been a petro-dependent territory. Even the indigenous people would regularly use oil tars seeping out of the ground to keep fires blazing throughout the night or waterproof their canoes before the Spanish even made contact. Crippled after its 19th century liberation, the country not only benefited from the discovery of oil, it was the one thing that allowed the government to remain stable via state funding or outright bribery. And for a while, although far from perfect, this worked. Modern Venezuela is one of the better-known petro-rentier states, receiving a large portion of its revenue from rent paid by businesses, governments and foreign individuals. Annual production exploded during the 1920s from just over 1 million barrels to 137 million, making Venezuela second only to the United States in total output by 1929. By 1935, the Venezuelan bolivar ballooned, with oil becoming the top priority, accounting for 90% of the country's total exports, which led to a terrible case of Dutch disease, a trend that would remain common into the 21st century. As a result, the country saw decent growth, although it was based heavily on extracting said oil to fund an otherwise unsustainable economy. This was also dependent on importing most of what it needed in exchange for its oil. As oil continued to be extracted, just 3 foreign companies controlled 98% of the Venezuelan oil industry: Gulf, Royal Dutch Shell and Standard Oil. The government tried to reform the oil sector to funnel funds into public coffers. The Hydrocarbons Law of 1943 was first set up in that direction, requiring foreign companies to give half of all oil profits to the state, a move that increased government income 6-fold over just 5 years. And for a while, this worked. In the 1950s, Venezuela took a seat at the table of economic superpowers. At the time, they were the 4th richest country in the world. By the 1960s, Venezuela's petrostate status loomed so large that it joined Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iran and Iraq, co-founding the Organisation of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, commonly referred to as OPEC. This was a masterful move in the realm of exports because it allowed them, and the countries that followed like the UAE, Qatar and Libya, to determine pricing by controlling output to keep prices high. This was technically price fixing through monopolistic market power, but neither of these factors really became an issue because they are sovereign entities, unlike a corporation that is at least in theory beholden to the laws of the countries they operate in. Venezuela, as well as the other countries listed, then nationalised their oil industries. For Venezuela, this nationalised body is Petroleos Venezuela SA, or PDVSA for short. This whole dynamic was put into overdrive when Venezuela continued to discover oil deposits that took it from a modest oil state to the single largest oil state in the world. From the early 2000s, this caused a boom in the economy, with gross domestic product peaking at $372 billion in 2012. This was fueled almost entirely by these prized exports. GDP, after all, is consumption plus investments plus government spending plus net exports. So how did a country with so much going for it end up so poor? Well, a lot of it can be summed up with a single word: mismanagement. An example of this would be the government's activity preceding and following the surge in oil prices in 2004. The International Energy Agency says that this increase was due to strong demand growth in Asia and North America. It also didn't hurt that an unfolding war in the Middle East disrupted the supply chains of other major global suppliers. Venezuela made moves to put it in a beneficial position to take advantage of this surge. New leadership in 1999 sought to introduce new oil fields, which had become quite stagnant in the 1970s, setting quotas and taking a hard stance against corruption and bureaucracy. They also gutted the PDVSA after an industry strike in 2002, replacing thousands of workers with people who would embrace the new objective. This left Venezuela flush with cash, and the government, at least on the surface, tried to improve living standards with it through very generous welfare systems. Healthcare, food subsidies and education acting as key representative pillars to show the world and its people signs of strong leadership. With enviable social assistance and rapid decreases in poverty, Venezuela started to look like an economic success story, especially in the eyes of its people, which was a primary goal of Venezuela's government, considering faith in these institutions was shattered over the last 50 years. With a rise in oil prices and massive welfare projects in the early 2000s, the country looked like it was about to become the greatest progressive success story in modern Latin America. But there was a big problem. It never really worked, or at the very least it wasn't sustainable. Of course, when done right, strong exports can sometimes insulate an economy from something like the 2008 financial crisis. Oil also typically has a low elasticity of both supply and demand, with the complex and costly process of initially setting up oil extraction and the fact that people don't have much choice of what to put in their cars respectively. Venezuela didn't really suffer from the cost of setting up extraction infrastructure either. Their nation practically floats on petroleum, meaning that they didn't have to invest into offshore or advanced drilling. They could effectively just stick a straw in the ground and crude would shoot out of it. What really tipped the scales was spending, and more specifically, how this money was spent. Corruption is a massive problem at all levels, from small bribes to local law enforcement all the way up to the national government, and with so much money up for grabs, there was an incentive to line people's pockets. The most desirable jobs in the country became government jobs funded by oil revenues because they had the means to embezzle it with ease. Billions of dollars in official account transfers remain unaccounted for to this day, and that's to say nothing of the more mundane corruption happening at an individual level. A story in 2006 revealed that a select group of Venezuelan bankers profited from the acquisition of Argentinian bonds by the Venezuelan government at the expense of the national treasury. Then there are these aforementioned social programs that look great on the surface. The government policies were essentially very populist and involved basically giving oil money away to keep the favour of the people. Of course, this isn't bad by itself. After all, those natural resources do belong to the people, but it made the country very dependent on oil prices, especially when it had to adhere to OPEC quotas. This meant that when times were good and oil prices remained high, Venezuela managed to brute force its GDP up until 2014. But this changed dramatically when a few things started going wrong very quickly. After rising for more than a decade, oil revenues fell by 93% between 2012 and 2020. During this same period, per capita income declined by 72%. By 2014, it tattooed 0 out of 10. Altogether, that gives Venezuela an average score of 1.6 out of 10, putting it into equal last place with Lebanon, a significantly smaller economy that didn't have many of the advantages that Venezuela did. If you're curious to see what's gone wrong over there, we made an entire video on Lebanon's economic collapse, which you should be able to click to on your screen now. Thanks for watching, mate. Bye.